Hello and welcome to the Middle East Forum's webinar series, Israel Insider with Ashley Perry. I'm Stacey Roman and I will be moderating this discussion today. We're pleased to have Mr. Ashley Perry, advisor to the Middle East Forum's Israel office, join us here each Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern to update us on all the events going on in Israel. Mr. Perry will be giving us a briefing on current Israeli affairs for 15 minutes and open it up for questions. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type out your question. Now, with no further ado, I'll turn the discussion over to Mr. Ashley Perry.
Thank you very much, Stacey, and good evening. Tonight, we are now 20 days from the elections, our fourth, as we know, in a year and a half. I thought tonight would really sort of focus, with such a small amount of time to go on what are the issues, what are the parties doing, what are their tactics, strategies in the days and weeks ahead. The first thing I'll say is that most people who have worked on campaigns or have studied the material, the research over the years knows that most people make up their mind around 2 weeks from the elections. That's something which those of us who've worked in the election campaign world know that's the key time really to make your case. That's when the undecideds, let's say, start to drop off a little bit and people really make up their mind. Not to say that people don't make up their mind afterwards, but there's a huge number which are sort of, that's the sort of, the date where many people's votes are solid. After that, there's a lot of work in trying to make sure that your people get up to vote, because just because people say that 20%, 25% will vote for you doesn't mean they will on election day, and especially the polls that we see day after day in Israel are not reflective of the fact that there is still, up to now, I think about 20 to 25% undecided. And that's quite a high number, especially at this stage. And there's a lot of discussion about exactly where these people go. But let's start tonight with the Likud. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu launched tonight, very late in the game, officially at least, the Likud campaign. Now, there's been a lot of talk about that in Israel, that many of the other parties have been spending hundreds of thousands of shekels on Facebook ads, social media, posters around the country, billboards. Likud haven't. They could have really, really saved as much money as possible. And we're really expecting a blitz starting today until the end of the campaign. There's going to be a real blitz of publicity, advertising, etc. Speaking to some of the people in the know, there does seem to be a lot of unease. Some characterize it as panic in the Likud because they really believed, and this is something Prime Minister Netanyahu really believed, that the very successful coronavirus vaccine campaign program would really catapult him to the numbers that he needs to form a government. Now, we've spoken about the magic number being 61. At the moment, Netanyahu and his 2 or 3 allies have no more than 43, 44 between them. That means he is far from that magic number of 61, even if Naftali Bennett, the only other person on the map who said that he could sit with Netanyahu, joins, there's still potentially 3 or 4 seats. Now, that is significant, and there is a lot of talk about the fact that behind the scenes, there's a certain amount of panic. What we have seen in the last week is quite unprecedentedly. We see Prime Minister Netanyahu going to the mainstream media which he disagrees with, let's say, characterizes as hostile. Tonight, in his launch of the campaign, he basically went after the media saying it's biased, it's like an additional political party, and it's against him, and it's against the continuation of Likud rule. Well, he gave them quite a lot of time on at least the 2 major channels. He had a half-an-hour interview. It was quite open. They asked him anything, and there's a debate whether how successful he was. The usually extremely cool, calm, organized Netanyahu, at least on some of the interviews he did on TV and radio, at some point at least, he lost I don't know if he lost his temper, but he certainly went off piece from the script a little bit. There was one point he sort of, made fun of some of his rivals. He made belittling comments about them. And there are those who see in this a certain element of panic from someone who's usually extremely composed. The Likud campaign is centered around 2 levels at this point. One is that this government has been successful. It's going to be the first country, Israel's going to be the first country to get out of coronavirus. And we see from Sunday, pretty much everything's going to be open. There's going to be opening wedding halls for, I think, up to 300 people, cinemas, sporting events, the whole education system. By the way, this is against the advice of the health ministry experts. And as we know, Prime Minister Netanyahu has been very beholden to their recommendations for pretty much most of coronavirus. And now, exactly as I talked about the magic two-week number, suddenly the whole of Israel pretty much is going to be open. But there's a lot of questions, and a lot of Likud people that I know are asking, why are people not voting Netanyahu, considering the success he's having? Well, there's a lot of reasons, and it goes on to his second level of what their attack is. Their attack is that it's either me, Prime Minister Netanyahu, or Yair Lapid of Yesh Atid. Now, in previous elections, there's always been a party which has been pushing the Likud neck and neck, sometimes 1 seat more, 1 seat less, 2 seats more. In the last elections, as we know, it was Benny Gantz of Blue and White. These elections, the closest party to the Likud, which are polling 28, even 27, is Yesh Atid, which is polling no more than 19. So there's no one direct threat. Now, it's very important for Netanyahu, especially in previous elections, to show that there is a threat, and that's why they need every single vote. It's much harder to do it when your nearest rival is at least 8, 9, perhaps more seats behind you. So it's very, very hard. Also, his main rivals, at least to a certain extent, are on the right wing and ideologically in line or even to the right of him. So he can't call Gideon Saar a left-winger. He can't call Naftali Bennett a left-winger. What he says is, and there's a certain amount of credence to this, that it's either me or Lapid, because he argues, if I don't continue as prime minister, then the only other option is Yair Lapid, because he's the largest party in this block of parties which potentially will not sit with Netanyahu. So that's what they're doing. Yesh Atid has been conspicuously silent to a certain extent, especially in the run-up to elections. There's a lot of talk about the fact that Yair Lapid has not been doing a lot of interviews. There's been a few tweets, and he jokingly said after Netanyahu went on a 20-minute rant about Lapid, Yair Lapid's Twitter feed basically put out a post, even my wife doesn't talk about me this much. But on the whole, Lapid is really trying to stay in the background. It's to a certain extent a clever ploy. But you would think, especially with everything that's going on this week around the Haredi community, the ultra-Orthodox community, we know there's been a lot of criticism throughout this campaign and before about the ultra-Orthodox community. Well, it's gaining momentum this week. There was a ruling this week in the High Court that reform and conservative conversions done in Israel would be recognized. That's unprecedented. The High Court ruled after 15 years of the government refusing and the Knesset refusing to create a law on this issue, and the ultra-Orthodox community, their political parties came up very, very strongly against this. Sort of moving across, as we say, to the ultra-Orthodox, especially the Ashkenazi group, party, United Torah Judaism, they're feeling a lot of flack from their people. They're going down in the polls, partly because despite what the non-ultra-Orthodox community in Israel are seeing and feeling, the ultra-Orthodox community feel very disappointed in their leaders. They feel that they are being bashed left, right, and center, and they're not standing up for them. We saw last week was the festival of Purim, and on Sunday was what's called Shushan Purim, which means Purim that was celebrated pretty much only in Jerusalem. And it's usually when people from around the country, especially in the ultra-Orthodox community, come into the ultra-Orthodox parts of Jerusalem and celebrate it with the big rabbis. And the Israeli government, knowing that this could be a problem with coronavirus infection rates going up a little bit, they basically canceled public transportation to Jerusalem, created crazy scenes of whole families walking miles to get into Jerusalem, et cetera, et cetera. But they feel that they're being unfairly treated. They're not getting what they believe is right, that they're being targeted. And remarkably, in the middle, or in a pandemic, the ultra-Orthodox party, United Torah Judaism, which is part of the government, has just decided today that they are no longer going to be beholden to any government decisions. They're not going to have any contact with the government, not going to have any contact with the police. not going to have any relationship with the media, and basically because they're hearing from their people that they are losing popularity, and so they feel that they have to show that they're strong. The Shas party, another ultra-Orthodox party, is basically doing what it usually does and reaching out to the more traditional-minded Sephardi voters, to the lower socioeconomic voters. Their slogan is Aryeh Deri, a strong Aryeh Deri is the leader of Shas, will strengthen the weaker part of society. So that's their traditional stance, and we'll see if that works. Other parties, Yamina is really going strong. It's basically trying, at least amongst all the other parties to a certain extent, they're trying to really show that they have policies. They put out an economic plan, which has got a lot of people talking. But a lot of people are basically trying to nail down exactly where Naftali Bennett will be, because he's the, as we said, he's the kingmaker. He's the only one who said that I will either sit with Bibi or not sit with Bibi. And he's trying to focus his supporters on, or potential base or potential outreach to those who really want to talk about the issues. And for him, it's how to get us out of coronavirus and the economy. One of the reasons Netanyahu hasn't been able to really make great hay from the coronavirus vaccine rollout is the fact that there's still almost 1 million people unemployed. 90,000 businesses have gone under in the last year. Israeli school children have barely been in school for the last year. And it's just from one shambles to another. This week, there was the whole issue of the airports. Are they open? Are they not open? Who can come home? Apparently, Israel is, according to the media here, the only country in the world where citizens, not foreigners, not permanent residents, Israeli citizens were simply not allowed to come into the country. And people, there was all these talks of people who needed, surgeries, people needed to come home. They were, living illegally in other countries because their visa ran out, but they weren't able to come home. And basically, there's no plan for it and no understanding of how to deal with the problem. And then we saw the Corona hotels, and we saw all sorts of sort of farces this week. So that's maybe part of the reason. Yisrael Beitenu, another party, which is a lot of people have been talking that they may be the surprise of these elections. They really haven't moved from their solid 7 seats all throughout the elections. But a lot of people are saying that they are going to be the surprise. And if they are, it's one reason and one reason only, because they have taken the hardest line against the ultra-Orthodox community. There is not a single event that happens in the ultra-Orthodox community that Yisrael Beitenu and Avigdor Lieberman, its leader, haven't tried to, jump on and say, well, this will not happen under the next government, because our sole aim is to make sure that the ultra-Orthodox parties are out of the next government. So that's really those issues. Some of the minor parties, Labour, are trying to go back to their sort of old-fashioned values, left-wing socialism. Merits are trying very hard to stay above the electoral threshold. They're really reaching out, especially to the Arab community, because they believe that that's where they can get the votes. They're very angry with Labour Party because, as you can imagine, the pool on the far left is very small, and they believe that Labour could, as they gain a seat, they could take away Meret's seat and push them back under. As we've said many, many times, any party which does not pass the threshold that at the moment is expected to will really change the game. And that's what a lot of parties are looking to do. And at the moment, Meretz is really close to that line. Blue and white have moved up a little bit, but there's always a poll every now and again which shows them below the electoral threshold. For the first time in any poll that I've seen, Ram, which is the Islamist party, which was, Netanyahu was courting a while back, for the first time passed the electoral threshold, but people don't expect it to do so on the day. So there's really a lot to play for. The numbers, it remains to be seen whether there'll be a big surprise. I'm sure there'll be, as we see with the Likud Blitz, media, social media, we will see some very strong messaging. We'll see what Israeli political commentators call the Gewalt move, which is the sort of, I guess they would call in America, the Hail Mary, which is the last gasp, desperate attempt to try and get voters either by putting out a panic, sometimes false, or basically really making an appeal that right-wing rule is in danger and you have to come out and vote. So we'll have to see. But at the moment, things haven't changed markedly. There's always a bit of movement, but not necessarily enough at this point for Netanyahu to form a government. And on the other side, there could be a government, but it would have to be, as we've talked about, a mishmash between pretty much the right all the way to the far left would have to sit in a government with a lot of different egos, a lot of different ideologies, with one thing in common: to form a government to end, for now at least, the political career of Benjamin Netanyahu. So it remains to be seen. And with that, I'm happy to answer any of your questions.
All right, thank you so much. So the first question, and we have quite a few on the conversion case. Could you comment on the implications of the Israeli Supreme Court ruling this week, recognizing the validity of conversions performed by conservative and reform rabbis in Israel?
Right. So first of all, it should be understood that there's various levels to this. First of all, to make aliyah, to immigrate to Israel, you're supposed to do it under what's called the law of return, which means that if you're a Jew, then you're allowed to come and live in Israel. Now, obviously, there's always been a debate about what does it mean to be a Jew, and for the first few decades of the state, there was very little debate. And then there was a few cases, so they decided to really detail it down, according to halakha, who's halakha, Jewish law, etc., etc. So they decided that anyone who has one Jewish grandparent can make aliyah. Then they decided, well, obviously someone who converts can also make aliyah. So who do we recognize? According to the state of Israel, anyone who converts from a recognized Jewish community can make aliyah. That doesn't matter if it's Reform, Conservative, Modern Orthodox, Ultra-Orthodox. If they're from a recognized conversion, then they can make aliyah. And that's true, and that's always been true. And ironically enough, while the ultra-Orthodox parties are slamming this decision, Aryeh Deri, who's the interior minister, is signing every day the ability for people who went through Reform and Conservative conversions to make aliyah. So there's a certain amount of hypocrisy, there's a certain amount of political campaigning here to be made of it. What this decision did is, for 15 years, there are certain individuals who converted within Israel, because in Israel we have around 400,000, maybe even more now, people who made aliyah but are not considered Jewish. They're Jewish enough to make aliyah but not considered halachically Jewish under Jewish law. So they basically took the government to court, and the Supreme Court kept on putting it off and saying, please, government and Parliament, Knesset, please make a ruling on this. And there were various committees that Netanyahu and others set up, and they were basically ignored, to the point where the Supreme Court said, we gave you 15 years to make a decision on this, so we're going to decide. And we recognize, we have no reason not to, recognize Reform and Conservative conversions from within Israel. And so, as one can imagine, the ultra-Orthodox parties jumped on this, but very little was said about the fact that for 15 years they ignored the situation, hoping it would just go away. As you can imagine, for Prime Minister Netanyahu, it's a very difficult issue. On the one hand, he needs his ultra-Orthodox partners. On the other hand, he also has to play nice because the vast majority of American Jewry is non-Orthodox, and he can't come out against these communities. So he's in a bit of a bind. He didn't react at all to this decision. So that's really what's happened. Remarkably, which I didn't mention, the day after there was a conference to talk about this issue, and an ultra-Orthodox party member, Yaakov Pindrus, was asked, well, what about the conversions that are done in the army? Because these people who make aliyah but are not considered Jewish have the possibility under a certain program or during their military training to also undergo a conversion. Interestingly enough, this is done under the chief rabbinate of the army, which is under the auspices of the chief rabbinate, which is under Haredi auspices. And amazingly enough, this United Torah Judaism MK said, well, as far as I'm concerned, these people are shiksas, which is a remarkably antagonistic and provocative word. He was slammed for it. He apologized for that, but he said he stands by his designation. And as you can imagine, that basically gave a lot of momentum for this anti-Haredi feeling, which is just building towards the election. So it's definitely extended this sort of focus on the Haredi community and its extremism within its ranks. And as you can imagine, it gave a bit of a boost for people like Liebman, even some within Yesh Atid and others. And there was pretty much wall-to-wall condemnation for what Pindrus said, even from the far right, sort of modern Orthodox community. There was wall-to-wall condemnation, but it's just another example of how one of the issues in these elections is really, what do we do with the ultra-Orthodox parties?
So real quick, can you just remind our viewers what the electoral threshold currently is?
Basically, I think it's 3.25. It's 4 seats. You either get 4 seats or you don't, or that's the minimum. If you only get 3 seats, you're basically your votes don't get counted and goes back into the system, and when the full amount is counted. So basically, the minimum amount of parties is 4. Minimum amount of seats for a party is 4, I should say.
Thank you. Because of so many elections in the past few years, is there any strong movement to change the voting structure in Israel, such as fewer parties, longer period between elections, maximum term for prime minister? And our viewer does admit this is doubtful, but would still like that question answered.
Remarkably not enough, to my mind at least. This is something I've been talking about for a long time, that we're moving towards political paralysis, and we're certainly there. Very little is talked about this. Tikva Hadasha, New Hope under Gideon Sa'ar, has said that we need term limits, also is talking about a 60-60 bicameral parliament, where 60 seats are in the current proportional representation, and 60 will be by regional voting. There are some who are talking about fixed terms. Israel Beitenu have long espoused a presidential system, similar in many ways to the American system, with fixed terms and also limit terms and more powers. As I said, something more towards the presidential system. But Yesh Atid, to the best of my knowledge, have, again, most of the parties are now saying there should be term limits. But very few are talking about changing the system, even though it's clear that it desperately needs it, quite simply because whoever becomes the next prime minister has to rely on at least 1 or 2 parties which are close to the threshold, who will obviously not agree to change it, so they will then fall under the threshold the next time it comes around. So it's always a problem. If we could get some of the larger parties together to agree on this, but at the moment, none of the larger parties will sit with each other. So it's not likely to happen at this point, but it's something that's, to my mind, at least desperately needed in the years ahead.
So with all the smaller parties with similar ideologies, would they ever consider uniting?
I mean, it's unclear exactly who, because the smaller parties, if we're talking about the religious Zionist list of Bezalel Smotrich, Blue and White, Meretz, you've got 3 very different parties there with very different ideologies. The only example of successful joining is with the joint Arab list. We saw in the last elections where they reached 15 together. Now, one of the major components, Ram, as we talked about, the Islamist party, has dropped out. Now they're polling around 9, also because we did talk about them when I ran down, but there's also a large discontent in the Arab public with them as well. So they're down to 9. But still, if they ran all separately, there's 4 parties, sometimes even 5. It's unlikely maybe one would go over the threshold. So they decided to run together. But there's sometimes talk of other parties joining. And we've certainly seen that in the past. But usually what we know is that the sum of its parts is usually not greater. So sometimes it's just not worth it. So that's why there haven't been so many partnerships at this point, and it's too late anyway for parties to join. That already passed a few weeks back.
Understood. And I know we've touched on this the past few weeks, but do you feel that the Arab vote will impact the election?
I mean, of course, yeah. We're talking about 22% of the public. Not all Arabs vote for ideological reasons. But it'll be very interesting to see, and we'll only know this after the elections, exactly how many voted and where they voted. You know, there's a lot of talk about some maybe even voting for right-wing parties like Likud. I talked last time that according to Likud's internal polls, that they've received at least one mandate from the Arab Republic, which I'm sure is relatively unprecedented. So it remains to be seen. As I said, Meretz is very much building on getting a certain amount of Arab votes. But most of the other parties, perhaps Labour will also get a certain amount, but most of the other parties outside of the Jewish community, we talked about that last week, it'll be interesting to see if they do, but none of the other parties are doing much in terms of outreach, to my knowledge, significant outreach, I should say, to the Arab public, again, beyond the Jewish community.
One viewer writes, might Sa'ar come back to Likud for the good of the nation?
I think definitely Sa'ar will eventually make his way back to Likud, but until Netanyahu leaves, that's not likely, especially now. It's, you know, the big debate is, will Sa'ar keep to his word? Because as I said, and Netanyahu even spoke about this, at the moment, the numbers show that even with Bennett, he does not have 61. The most obvious partner for such a government with Likud, with Bennett, with the ultra-Orthodox parties and with Smotrich would be Gideon Sa'ar. As we talked about previously, most of the people on the list are previously Likud or have definitely seen themselves in that ideological space. So it would make the most sense for them to go back, for them to sit in that government. Gideon Sa'ar has said he will not sit under Netanyahu. Again, speaking to a lot of people within the Knesset, within the system, a lot of people are skeptical about that, but he's been pretty strong on it. So it really, that will be the big test, because I'm sure Netanyahu, as the great strategist that he is already trying to see where he can take maybe even 2 or 3, if that's what he needs, from some other list, because that's what he was able to do last time. He was able to take the Labour Party, you know, break it in two. The Blue and White Party, he was definitely able to, you know, rip in 2. And you had even the Derech Eretz Party of Hauser and Hentel, which he was able to bring into his government. Again, these are all people who said that they will not sit in a Netanyahu government. So there's a lot of skepticism within Israel about making such promises, because we've seen this before. But at the moment, I don't see Sa'ar returning to Likud, but I think the day after Netanyahu, there'll be a lot of people who return to the Likud in one way or another.
So currently, what are the routes that Netanyahu could take to get those 61 seats?
Pretty much, as I said, you know, again, if Bennett does decide to go with Netanyahu, and he hasn't ruled that out, then at the moment, according to polls, again, these are just polls, he'll still need some. Now, where could he get them from? We've seen Netanyahu, you know, really reach across the aisle. He's taken people from the far left in the past into his government, as long as he'll get that 61. So pretty much he would look at anyone from the Labour Party onwards. And there you've got the Labour Party. You know, again, we saw last time 2 out of the 3, or 3 out of the 4 Labour Party members basically went with the government, Netanyahu, again, even though they said they wouldn't. In fact, Amir Peretz, the previous leader of the party, shaved off his moustache so we could read his lips that he will not join Netanyahu's government. And there he was without a moustache in Netanyahu's government. So, you know, you can understand why there's a certain amount of skepticism in Israel. But I don't think anyone, Yesh Atid, Yisrael Beitenu has shown that they're pretty solid. So really the only possibility that if I was in Netanyahu's strategy meetings, the only ones that he could see is within New Hope in Gideon Sa'ar's party. And there's a lot of people he's worked with. And there's a lot of things that he could potentially offer just to manage to get over that. And I'm sure this is something that they're thinking about now, and they're not necessarily waiting until after the elections.
Thank you. And if you don't mind, if we could go back real quick to the conversion case. If they receive full citizenship, does this mean the rabbis have to approve their marriage to another Israeli Jew to take place within Israel?
That's another issue. I sort of touched on it before, but in Israel, there's 2 layers to it. Those who are able to make Aliyah, and there are those who are considered Jewish for the rabbinate. Unfortunately, we have a situation where there's, as I said, 400,000, 500,000 people who are not considered, who are not Muslims, they're not Christians, let's say, they're not Jews, they're people considered of no religion, and they really have no way of marrying. There was a law a few years ago, Yeshua Beitenu put through, where basically it says someone of no religion can marry someone of no religion. But as you can imagine, that's very limiting. Marriages that take place abroad are recognized in Israel regardless of who they're between. But in Israel, you have to get married through one of the religious structures. So a Muslim can marry a Muslim, a Christian can marry a Christian, a Jew can marry. But the rabbinate will not recognize someone who got married, who got converted through perhaps reform, or has only one who is a Jewish father or a Jewish grandparent. So that's a very different level. This ruling wasn't about that. This ruling was about the status to be able to make Aliyah, because a convert can make Aliyah if they're from a recognized community outside of Israel, but if they're inside Israel, then they can be considered a Jew to stay in Israel and get that status within, let's say, the secular authorities, if they, now according to High Court, if they converted through a Reform Conservative, which certainly wasn't the case up until recently.
All right, well, thank you so much. We've come to the close of our webinar. Ashley, thank you again for taking time to update us this week. For our viewers, please join us on Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern for a webinar with Ali Aliyami discussing MBS, backs down, Qatar's surprising victory in the GCC. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a great day.